In today's video, we're taking a look at the latest trade talk around players like Kane and JT Miller. Plus, we're going to talk a bit about David Pastrnak as he enters the final year of his deal. Will he extend in Boston, or could he possibly be moved this year as well? Plus, we have some updates on the salary cap, some signings, some ECHL affiliates, as well as some more UFA rumors. We'll discuss all the latest coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. As I mentioned, we have a variety of NHL news and rumors to take a look at here today. Some of today's information comes from a new 32 Thoughts podcast put out by Elliotte Friedman and Jeff Merrick, which was recorded over in Paris, France, as the NHL is doing a media tour over in Europe. Of course, they're going to be having games over there in the not too distant future as the NHL returns to that part of the hockey, which has been kind of on pause here for the last couple of years. And of course, we have some other sources here as well. One of the things that they did on a podcast was a couple of interviews, including Deputy Commissioner Bill Daly. One of the tidbits that they talked about, which Daly's on record here saying that he feels that the salary cap very well might increase sooner than we thought. I know originally they were saying not long ago, probably 3 more seasons, but of course revenues are projecting quite well, and now they're saying it's potential for 2 more seasons. So essentially that would put us after 23-24. So of course we're going into 22-23 now. We just saw a $1 million increase. Probably going to have a similar situation next offseason. So we'll have another small increase going into 23-24. But then it's possible and potential that we could see a significant increase at that point. Now, significant could be a number of things. Really, anything more than $1 million would be more significant. So I don't know how much we're talking here. Could it be 3, 4, 5, 6 million? We don't really know. No numbers were really discussed. But ultimately, it's nice to hear, though, that the revenue numbers are looking good and that there is a possibility of having a salary cap increase sooner than they were anticipating, which is always good to hear. Now, some other news as well. The Dallas Stars have signed one of their prospects from the 2021 NHL draft, and that's 6th round pick Francesco Arcuri, who is a 6'2", 200-pound center iceman, born in Ontario, played for the Kingston Frontenacs of the OHL. He's had some pretty good seasons there and gets his ELC officially on the books. As I mentioned, we have some news when it comes to the East Coast League and some new affiliates being announced. The San Jose Sharks now have their ECHL affiliate with will be the Wichita Thunder, and the Arizona Coyotes are now affiliated with the Atlanta Gladiators. Of course, the Gladiators were formerly the Senators, and they've moved their team to the Allen American. So a lot of those do get shuffled around and changed a lot because they're usually only short-term NHL deals that they end up working out, but that's a number of teams that have made changes in that regard. When it comes to that, another piece of NHL news as well as the Seattle Kraken have made some more additions to their hockey operations staff, including former NHL player Frans Nielsen, as well as former longtime Shark and son of Doug Wilson, the longtime GM Doug Wilson Jr. He officially joins the hockey ops staff of the Seattle Kraken as an amateur scout. Of course, that's where his background is in scouting, so he's going to go back to what he did for a long time in San Jose. Now, there is some UFA talk. Of course, this comes from the 32 Thoughts podcast as well, where Friedman goes on to say that he doesn't think the Calgary Flames are done. Of course, they haven't put out a podcast in a while, so they talked about the Johnny Gaudreau, Matthew Tkachuk scenario, as well as Nazem Kadri signing there. And after the Kadri deal, we've seen a few more veterans get contracts, so I do think it's fair to say that Kadri signing was probably holding things up a little bit. Went on to talk a bit about the fact that it was basically down to the Flames and the Islanders. The Avalanche were in the mix as well, but he doesn't think things were as serious with the Islanders as some reporters made it out to be, that it was essentially a case that the Flames were the most aggressive and obviously the first to free up the space. So, he does not completely sure as well that it was 7x7 being offered from the Islanders to Kadri as well. But at the same time, he goes on to talk about the fact that that Brad Treliving's had a fantastic summer given the difficult circumstances he was presented with. But of course doesn't think they're done and wonders if they might have interest and been sniffing around UFA forward Evan Rodriguez, now formerly of the Pittsburgh Penguins. He had a really nice year last year in Pittsburgh and has quietly been a productive player for a few seasons, and I'm surprised he's not signed here as of yet, but certainly wondering if the Flames might be interested there. And one interesting tidbit as well on newly signed Paul Stastny, of course, who we know went to the Carolina Hurricanes on a one-year deal at $1.5 million. Elliot Friedman's confirming that he actually had an offer that was worth more money with the Vegas Golden Knights, but turned that down in exchange to go to the Carolina Hurricanes. Now, this tells me a couple of things. One, we know that Paul has played with Vegas before. He was there for like a season and a half or something before he went back and was traded back to the Winnipeg Jets. So we know that he's played there, so he knows what it's like. But the other thing, too, that I know wasn't mentioned on the podcast, but I'm surprised I haven't really seen it written anywhere, but Paul Stastny's best friend is Max Pacioretty. So I know they were quite stoked about playing together in Vegas. So that obviously they were happy about that. It didn't last too long, mind you. So obviously Carolina, he gets a chance to play with his best friend again, even though Pacioretty's hurt to start the year. But secondly, he's been to Vegas and Pacioretty's been to Vegas and obviously just got traded on unfavorable terms. Pacioretty's hasn't had a lot of good things to say about how they treat the players and the expectations and everything like that. Like, he didn't have a lot of kind things to say after the trade. So ultimately, I really don't think Stastny would go to Vegas after his own experience, what Pacioretty just went through, and all that. Now, of course, Stastny apparently does still skate with some of the Vegas players in the offseason. So there was talk that, obviously there was interest there, and obviously he was familiar with the team from before. Maybe he'd go back, but it really doesn't surprise me in the least, given the relationship to Pacioretty and how everything played out with him. So we'll see how things work out for Paul Stastny in Carolina. But interesting to hear that they actually offered him more money and he turned it down. Now, of course, on to the trade section of the day, or the rumor section of the day. One player I do want to talk about, which I've seen reports on here for the last few days. There's been a few articles around Bruins winger David Pastrnak. Now, there's no rumor suggesting right now that he's going to get traded, but there's a number of articles from Bruins media kind of wondering, I guess, as if fans and everybody should be concerned that he's not signed an extension. Essentially, I don't think that's the case, because a couple of things. As we know, Don Sweeney's had a very busy offseason and largely putting the team back together, bringing back Bergeron, Krejci, etc. Like, he's been busy with other more pressing items, and I think Pastrnak even acknowledged that in an interview himself. But the belief is that before Pastrnak commits to another long-term deal, that he would like to kind of make sure that this team is going to be in good shape moving forward. I think it's fair to say that he's probably excited for the upcoming season. I'm sure he's excited to have David Krejci back. Bergeron's coming back. Of course, a lot of the other guys are still there, Marchand, McAvoy, etc., even though some of them are dealing with injuries. He's going into the final year of his deal, but he knows a lot of those players that he's played with for a long time are not going to be there forever. And guys like Bergeron and Krejci might not even be there after the upcoming season. By the time his new contract kicks in, they could possibly not be on the roster anymore. Then, of course, what's the future hold for Brad Marchand? He's having a major surgery. Is he going to be able to be the same player when he comes back? There's, certainly some question marks around there. Anything to do with the hips is usually, a big deal. So we'll have to see. So at this point, I think I've seen some Bruins media say if Pastrnak hasn't signed an extension by the trade deadline, that they need to think about it at least, because losing him to free agency would be such a major blow to this organization, especially if they may not bring back Bergeron, Krejci. Like, it could be a whole new version of a teardown here, which we don't really expect to happen, right? These Bruins players are all coming back kind of for one last dance is what it sounds like. We'll have to wait and see where things go. But certainly I think it's fair to understand David Pasternak's, desire to wait and see and get a better indication of the future before making a long-term commitment. But at the same time, I think it's also fair to say that the Bruins and Pastrnak haven't really had much time to really engage in much conversations anyway, because Sweeney's had his focus, attention, put elsewhere, trying to get these other deals done and get this team ready for the upcoming year. But David Pastrnak, going into the final year of his contract until he signs an extension, is definitely going to be one of the more interesting players to keep your eye on. He's young, he's dynamic, he's a top scorer, and if he's not signed, there will be speculation over his future. Now, one name that came up on the podcast as well, Jeff Merrick, talking about the Avalanche when they were talking about Nazem Kadri departing and a potential replacement, is he wonders about JT Miller. Now, of course, he didn't suggest that he had information saying that they were interested, but I know last year at the deadline, they were a team that was mentioned. Doesn't mean that it was a real serious thing, but the Avalanche have been a team over the past couple of years, really, that have been involved in a lot of high-profile top players that have been available. Now, of course, you don't always hear about that until deals actually take place, but they've been heavily interested. That much we can say. They even were one of the first to inquire last year about Patrick Kane. Of course, nothing came to be, but I would suspect, as we'll talk about Kane here in a minute as well, that they will be interested and maybe even inquire once again. We'll see. But if you think about it, the Nathan MacKinnon extension, which has not worked out yet, and Merrick and Friedman talked about this on the podcast too, and Friedman confirms the other speculation that I've seen elsewhere, that there's a possibility Nathan MacKinnon might become the NHL's highest paid player, or at the very least, right up there with Connor McDavid. It might be a little less, but it's going to be in the same neighborhood. He may opt to take a little bit less and try to keep this team as I guess as well situated as possible to have that Stanley Cup window open and not be too tight money constraint wise. But at the end of the day, Nathan MacKinnon has been on a very team friendly deal. So I think essentially here he's talented enough to justify somewhere in that $10 to $12 million range. What that final number works out to is hard to say exactly, but they've certainly had discussions. But it's not done, but it could be done before the season starts, or if not in the early part of it. But Nathan MacKinnon will be a long-time Colorado Avalanche player and one of the league's top, if not the top player. So they're going to have to factor that in with any long-term plans. So Merrick speculated that you bring in somebody in who's on the final year of their deal as a deadline acquisition, or even doing it sooner, might be wise to give them another best chance possible to repeat. Obviously, not having Kadri there, will certainly hurt. And JT Miller can provide a lot of the same things. He can obviously give you very significant offensive output. He can play with edge. He can play with snarl, the same as Kadri. And could give you a similar type of player so that you wouldn't really feel like you lost a beat going into the playoffs. So we'll have to wait and see. Obviously, at this point, we still don't have any real, firm idea that an extension's possible in Vancouver. It still seems like a trade is more likely, and it hasn't been really much new information here in the last little while. So we'll see if the Avalanche do emerge here, as Merrick suggests, as being one of the players for Miller once things kind of heat up around that situation a little bit further. Now on to Patrick Kane. Elliot Friedman obviously wanted to address a lot of the Patrick Kane rumors that have been around the NHL here as of the past week or so. I know when we first started talking about Kane, there's been a few teams mentioned now, but the Oilers, by Oilers media, were heavily mentioned on numerous situations, and obviously that seems to be the case, that the Oilers are indeed interested. Now, Friedman confirms, based on his knowledge of the situation, that he says that the interest in Kane by the Edmonton Oilers is absolutely legit. Doesn't mean they're going to get a deal done, but his feeling on it is kind of what I said before, was that that Kane likely starts the year in Chicago, wants to see where things go, and it's probably better for a player like him to wait and see as the season goes along, and maybe be a deadline deal once he can evaluate these teams where he might want to go. Because if he's going to want to go somewhere, he's going to want to have a shot at winning a Stanley Cup. Then he can evaluate his future in the offseason from there and decide where he might want to sign his next contract and play for the next little while for his NHL career. But certainly hearing from Elliot Friedman, who's one of the top insiders in the game, confirming that the Edmonton Oilers absolutely have legitimate interest and certainly want to kind of pencil him in as their top player that they want to kind of follow along and see if they can add at the deadline, certainly tells us that the Oilers are very serious and confident that they might be able to make a run for a Stanley Cup. Of course, they also interviewed Leon Draisaitl, obviously who's in Europe, for, being from Germany, on this podcast as well. And Leon kind of confirms that essentially this team is confident that they can make a run for it. He says he understands that they're going to have to likely go through the Avalanche again, that they're really good team. He talked about his injury he dealt with in the playoffs and all that. And, essentially the Oilers are going to be a little bit of a different team, minusing a few players here, but essentially that, they're ready and they want to make a run for it. So obviously he couldn't ask him about Patrick Kane or anything like that, but certainly seems like he's excited and the Oilers are ready to go to see what they can accomplish this year. Having made a few changes in the offseason, be interested to see what they can do. And could Patrick Kane be on the horizon to be an Edmonton Oiler later in the year? I know there's other people that seem convinced now that he's going to be a legit target for the Maple Leafs, and maybe he will be. Hard to say, but there are going to be other teams too. I would say the Rangers, Avalanche, etc. will all be watching that Patrick Kane situation extremely close. He's still a very talented player who can put up some real good offensive numbers. He's got Stanley Cup experience, so he will be heavily sought after. There's no doubt. He will be able to also call his own shot given the terms of his contract and decide what he wants. So let me know your thoughts on everything discussed today down in the comments. We'll talk about it further. If you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe and stick around. We'll keep you up to date with the latest news, rumors, and analysis on all 32 NHL teams. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.